Well, I'm really interested in that last point that you just brought up, that maybe in America there's a particular sense in which our value or worth or dignity is defined by being independent and self-determining and active. And that seems to me like a very different understanding than, I don't know, like the Christian vision. And so I guess when you bring particularly a Christian lens into this and a Christian understanding, how would you push back against some of those assumptions? Like especially the one you mentioned that it's bad to become dependent, or it's bad to rely on others, or it's undignified, right? Like how would you, I guess, reframe that from a Christian understanding?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things, so there's a Christian ethicist, contemporary thinker, Stanley Hauerwas, who talks a lot about how our ethos is kind of driven by a couple of things. One is we want to get out of life alive. That's one of his terms. And then the other term is, the other thing he talks about is that the Christian life is, in a sense, about learning how to live out of control.
Yes.
And so there's this idea that, and this all came to the fore for me when I started writing about this, because I became interested in death, not directly, but through an experience of illness. And I was diagnosed with cancer early on in my doctoral studies, and began to, I'm fine now, but, had to go through treatment while I was thinking about issues of life and death and sickness.
So had you already chosen that focus before your diagnosis?
No, not
okay,
at all.
no. So it came out.
I was going to go do something else completely, and then I was teaching bioethics as a teaching assistant. So I would talk to students at 1 p.m., 2 p.m., and 3 p.m. on Friday afternoon, and then I'd walk down to the cancer center and get my chemotherapy infusion, and then go home and zonk out with chemo brain for the weekend, and then start it all over. And one of the things I started wrestling with was this idea of control, and the way in which our sort of the limitations of our bodies, when we bump up against them, challenge our notions that we've always been in control and we will always be in control. And for me and my wife, we didn't have any kids yet, but we were thinking maybe we want to have kids, but we had a 5-year plan in place. Right. We would be married for 5 years, and then we would have our kids. And then year 4, this happened. And it's we may never be able to have kids. Maybe we weren't in control the same way we thought. And so what does that mean for our faith life? What does that mean for how we think about where God is in all this, and, how we rely on him? And so it became intensely personal, but through this idea of control, and what does it mean that we can control certain things, but we can't ultimately control everything. Right. And that's the place where faith comes in. Yeah. That's the place where trust comes in. And ultimately, death signals the limit of our control. It's the ultimate limit. It's the thing that we can never and will never be able to fully control. And so it comes back into our life as sort of a, insofar as we're aware of that, we may also start to notice the other things that we may have to trust God in, and that's okay, and that's actually good for us. And so, this idea of control versus trust, I think, also plays out in our relationships with each other. The assumption that we live our best life when we are fully in control, right, is one that comes very natural to many of us, but it leaves out some very key parts of what it means to be human, what it means to ultimately, I think, accept what's outside of our control as a gift. Yeah. And I think that that's a big sort of Christian teaching. Creation itself is a gift, right? And it's to be received in that posture. And it's only in receiving it in that posture that we can treat it as what it really is. Yeah. And to the degree that we see creation itself simply as resources for us to do whatever we want to do with, we're misusing it. We're not seeing properly. Yeah. So, this idea of control and independence, I think, is one that, for me, I've learned to see the basic spiritual impulse behind Christianity as one of recognizing and appreciating what it means to be dependent, not just in my relationships, but on God, ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, that seems to be so fundamental to a Christian understanding and just a Christian way of living, right? Like that word receive that you talked about, it just seems like that trust and receptivity, and that having more of an ethic of control and self-reliance, that seems like that would be a pretty significant barrier between the soul and God. And so in a strange way, I think suffering and death can be this way of God. God can work in those things to bring us around to that posture of trust in him in a way that maybe can't happen in other ways. Like a few years ago, my grandpa, who I was pretty close to, he died in 2017. And I was pregnant with my third kid at the time, and so I couldn't go see him. And he was kind of declining. It wasn't this illness per se, but there was a period in the summer where he was really thinking about taking his own life. And I think it was this effort to have control over. And he was still living at home. He wasn't in, like debilitating pain. Of course, I'm sure he was in a certain amount of pain, but and there was a point where he was like, had like a loaded gun in his walker just to kind of like have it around as this option. And I just remember at the time, like praying a lot about, I just didn't want him to do that. Right. Because I think there's like this dance between the soul and God. And I think if we choose to cut that off prematurely, then we cut off the opportunity for God to work in our lives. And my grandpa was like, an agnostic / atheist. I mean, my last conversation with him, I told him I was praying for him, and he was like, well, if I believed, I'd be praying for you too, But then, he did not kill himself. He did not take his own life. And he died in December. And he actually had, like, after that kind of time in the summer when he almost killed himself, there was this kind of like rebound period where he felt a lot better, and he had these like last couple of really good months before his final decline in December. And in December, he, like for the last few days of his life, he lost the ability to speak. But before that, the only thing he wanted these old, he was Southern, he wanted these old, like traditional kind of Southern hymns played, like Come As You Are and Oh Thou Fount of Every Blessing. And even though he had lost the ability to speak, he like wanted just to hear that music. And I don't know, when I heard that, I held on to that as this like, I don't know, this sign that there was something in him in that experience of dying that was turning toward God, and I don't, whatever happened then, it was this like wordless communion between him and God. But I just think if he had taken matters into his own hands and decided, I want to die, I want to have control of my own death, then that process of dying and that turning to God that I think was happening could not have happened, right? And so sometimes I think about the moment of death and how much God can work in that final moment when we're, like you said, really pushed to the limit, or we're like faced with the myth that we can be our own God,